make all of our blocks. This part is really fun and it goes super fast. You can plan out all of your blocks before if you want, or you can just make them randomly. That's what I like to do. I just grab the fabric as I go and I see what I end up with in the end, and it's really fun. So we are going to start with all of the pieces that we cut and our half square triangles that we made last week. So we are assembling the half square triangles together first, and then those will come together for a center block, and then we will add on each of the outside pieces around to build our block. But before we start sewing, we need to figure out our 1/4 inch seam on our machine. Your machine may have a 1/4 inch piecing foot, which makes it really easy to just follow the edge of that foot. My machine doesn't, and I've never bothered to buy one, so this is how I've always set up a 1/4 inch. I use one of my acrylic rulers and I just drop the needle down to where it's sitting on a 1/4 inch. I make sure that the ruler is square, so it's lined up perfectly. And then I just use a piece of masking tape to mark off that line on my bobbin cover. So depending how your machine looks, this may look different. You may already have a 1/4 inch marking, but this is just how I've always done it, and it works pretty well for me. So once we've got that set up, we want to test it and make sure that it's actually correct. So I have cut a bunch of 3-inch squares, and I'm going to be putting them right sides together and then sewing them at a 1/4 inch, which is going to be right along the edge of the tape that we set up. And I'm also going to sew them at a scant 1/4 inch. And before we do that, we need to use a leader piece. I like to use these just to catch any like thread nests that happen before I start sewing on my piece. And another quick reminder to turn your stitch length down to 2. So that is a full 1/4 inch where the piece is guiding right along the edge of the tape. And then these next 2 pieces I'm going to do at a scant 1/4 inch. What a scant 1/4 inch does is accounts for the thickness of the thread and then the fold in the fabric when we press it. And to do that, we just leave a tiny little gap. See, that's a full 1/4 inch and that's a scant 1/4 inch. It is a very small, subtle difference. I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're sewing a bunch of tiny pieces together over and over again, it really adds up over time. So it's worth it to take the time to figure this out. So here they are side by side. The bottom is the full 1/4 inch. The top is the scant 1/4 inch. You can see the slight difference in the thickness of the seam allowance there. So once we've done that, we're going to press them. I like to press one set to the side and press the other set open. So this way I can see if my pressing is having an effect, because when you press to the side, both fabrics are kind of being folded over. So it does take up just a tiny bit more fabric. So I did 2 sets, pressed each one each way. And then to check them, I'm using my acrylic ruler and just laying that right on top of the piece with the edge right next to that cut edge and seeing how long they should be. So they should be 5.5 inches, because 3 plus 3 is 6 minus our 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side should give us 5.5. So you can see this was my full 1/4 inch and it's just a little short. This one was pressed open. It's a little bit closer. And then this was my scant 1/4 inch, and you can see it's pretty much perfect. And then my scant 1/4 inch pressed open. So for some reason, when you do scant 1/4 inches, it always works. This is a good test to run. If your pieces are ending up too short like this, that means your seam allowance is too big. If your pieces are ending up bigger than the 5.5 inches, that means your seam allowance is too small. And then you can make adjustments. So once you've got the 1/4 inch seam allowance figured out, we are going to make our test block. I always like starting with a test block. This is a good way to make sure your seam allowance is correct and figure out if there's anything you want to do different before you chain piece all your blocks. And a quick note on the layout here, the pattern is written one way, but you can do whatever you want. You could do a little block in the center like this. You could do all diagonals, creates these little cool diamond shapes. You could do little triangles, kind of like flying geese. Like, change it up if you want to. Do whatever you want. It's your quilt. You're the boss. I'm going to be doing the way we have it in the pattern just for demonstration, but I do like to try to keep this kind of like pinwheel shape going with the light and dark colors. But to do the pinwheel, just make sure all of your points are leading to the center. So we're ready to start sewing pieces together. This is exciting. So I am matching up these 2 pieces with that diagonal seam matched perfectly as it's going through the corner. And I'm pinning these here. I don't actually pin when I sew, but I did want to show you kind of that process if you're someone who likes to use pins. I will use pins when I'm matching up points, which I'll show you in our next step. But if you want to use pins, go for it. I would also suggest maybe try not using pins because that can be fun too. So I've got my piece at the machine here and I'm lifting the foot and kind of tucking it right up to the needle. And then based on kind of my test pieces, I know that scant 1/4 inch was working well for me. So I'm going to use that. And I'm going to chain piece here. So I'm grabbing that second set of triangles, making sure that the diagonal lines are meeting, and then feeding those in right behind that first piece at a scant 1/4 inch. Once I have sewn these, and this is a quick tip, go ahead and feed your leader right back in when you're done. So that way, when you're ready to come back and sew, you're all ready to go. Okay, we're at the ironing station and we are going to press these open. I find that pressing these open makes it easier to match the points in our next step. So I talked before about like sometimes I press open, sometimes I press to the side. I think a lot of that's just going to come with experience and making quilts, and you'll kind of figure out like what you want to do in each situation. So I press those open and now I need to match up these 2 points. So I just bring them together like this and I kind of just get in there and look real close and match up the 2 kind of triangles. And then I usually just do 1 pin kind of at a diagonal, but I did see this recently, someone doing the fork pins where you have like 2. So I thought I'd try with 2 pins, 1 on either side of the seam. This will keep the seam allowance open flat and make sure nothing moves. So I'm going to give that a try. This is another tip if you really want to like make sure your points are on point and dialed. You can use Elmer's glue. So just do a little dab right where you need to match those points, get them lined up, and then set the iron on there for a good few seconds to dry the glue before you start sewing. So we are sewing these together, and as they go through, you'll see this kind of triangle shape from where we pressed open. We want the needle to go right through the point of that triangle. That's how we're going to get a really nice point match on the other side of our piece. So just do your best. And all of this to say, if your points aren't matching up and this is feeling tricky, don't sweat it. This is a skill that takes a lot of practice and a lot of time to get good at. So just do your best. And as long as your fabric ends up sewn together, you're good to go. One downside to the glue trick is it is a little annoying to get your seams back open to press them. So like I said, I don't use the glue all the time. That's just a trick. Like if you really want to make sure your points match, if you're doing something really finicky, just wanted to show you that trick. It's not what I typically use, especially for a quilt like this, which for me is just like a fun, quick quilt. I'm not too stressed about it, but hey, look at that. We did pretty good on the points. I'm pretty happy with that. Not too shabby. All right. Next up, we are sewing on each of these rectangle pieces. So we're starting with our short one first. And I'm noticing here, my piece is a little bit shorter than the pieces I'm sewing it to. That can happen. That is probably because my seam allowance was not big enough, actually. And now, so my seam allowance where I sewed all of those together to create this block was probably just a tiny bit too small. Or I also could have cut my piece a tiny bit too short. So, anything could have happened, but I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to line it up, kind of split the difference. So there's a little bit short on the front and a little bit short on the end. It's no big deal. I did kind of mess up here in the way I fed this through the machine because I had to stop and make sure that my seam allowance was staying open as I was feeding this through the machine. I will do better on my next one, which I will point out to you. But I went ahead, I pressed that seam to the side just because it's easy to press these to the side. And then, so this time when I'm sewing this rectangle piece on, I'm going to be doing that piece on the bottom and having these seams up so that way I can keep an eye on them as they're going through the machine and I can make sure those seams stay open. And it's a lot easier that way. Also, you notice these pieces don't perfectly match up because of that blue piece was a little short. It's not a big deal. Like, don't stress about it. It's all going to be fine. I promise. Okay. We got that piece on. We pressed it to the side. And now we do this third and fourth piece. And look at that. We've got a test block. Actually, it's not a test block. It's one of our actual blocks. And it's beautiful. And I love it. And I'm so excited to make the rest of my blocks. So to finish up the rest of the blocks, I'm just going to chain piece them. And I just grab whatever's next in the pile. I really don't think too hard about the fabric placement. I think this pattern really lends itself to just being random and scrappy, and you can just sew your blocks together without really thinking too much, which is honestly what I love about making this pattern. So here we are. Here's all of my blocks. And you see, like, that one has two light ones, and that one has a lot of the skulls and daisies. And it doesn't matter. Once we sew them all together into a quilt, everything's going to be all spaced out and random and fun and so cute. And I'm so excited. Come back next week when we make our quilt top.